that time. And take a rifle and shoot the hog in between the eyes. And when it dropped down on the ground, then you slit its throat and let it bleed. And my dad always preferred that they be skinned because he was going to sell them. He didn't like the ideas of hogs that had been scalded and scraped because that left the hide on. And he didn't want to fool with that hog hide when he was selling them at retail level. So you skinned the hogs and hung them. And of course, the next day, the liver and heart were available for sale at the store. And after they'd hung, this was during the cool weather that this all had to be done because there was no refrigeration involved. This was just out in my grandfather's garage where the entrails were pulled out away from the building and left there for the coyotes to eat. But so that was my first experiences as doing anything involved with the meat business, and that was strictly slaughtering. I did learn just a little bit at that time, but not very much from him. Then after I'd been in the Navy and in college, and this would have been in the years of 46 and 47, I was working while I went to school at a grocery store in Lincoln.
Kansas or Nebraska?
Lincoln, Nebraska, yes, because I was going to the University of Nebraska, of course. And I had the opportunity to do a number of things there, and of course one of them was work in the meat department, and I did learn just a few things while I was there, but the experience was good for me. Then after I graduated from university, that would have been in 1949, well, my dad and I purchased this store here in Blue Rapids in July 19th of 1949. And so for the first about 5 years, between my dad and I, we did our own meat cutting in that store. And so he was just a ex-farmer that had learned the meat cutting the hard way, just in order to be able to sell it. And so actually I learned from him what he knew, and we cut meat together. And about 5 years after we'd been here, that had been probably around 53, why we hired the first full-time meat cutter, and it was Willis Hicks, and he was taking on-the-job training underneath a GI program, and we were supposed to teach him, plus he studied out of books on how to cut meat. And during that time, Dale Reed worked for me for about a year. He was wanting the name of someone that did, but it was about that time that I hired Eldon Davis. He came from been a Bogart employee as a butcher, and he came experienced. And Eldon Davis worked for me for over 20 years, and generally, the only time I did the meat cutting was when he was on vacation, and he did it all the rest of the time himself. But it's interesting to note that at that time, all we used was what was called hanging beef, or purchase was hanging beef. And Eldon would be specific about that, but everything was purchased by sides or by quarters, and you broke them down from there on and actually into your cuts that you were interested in. And it was near the end of that period of time that times were changing, and you were starting to buy boxed beef. That was vacuum packed wholesale cuts that were packed in boxes. And so that went on for a number of years that way, where we went from hanging beef to boxed beef. You were only buying the more saleable cuts and not a lot of the unsaleable cuts. So there wasn't near the amount of waste or throwaway stuff that you had prior to that time. Did make a, so Eldon was a real dependable, and after that many years, why, he wanted a little change. And so when he quit, and I'd said, we had a service meat counter all that time, and I'd said, whenever, and if Eldon ever left, why, I was going self-service. I wasn't going to try to run another service meat counter, because Eldon had been able to satisfy the public satisfactorily that way, and I knew that it was very unlikely I would ever get a replacement to do that again. So we did. I had the self-service material ordered by the time he had quit, and I hired a lady, Verna Foley, who was not really an experienced butcher, but to be the meat cutter. And I didn't know too much about how to wrap meat and so forth, and so I did go a couple days over to Hiawatha to another grocer that was doing a good job in self-service meats, and learned what I could. And then we had a specialist that came out from the warehouse that helped train Verna what I could train her to where she did the meat cutting up until the time that I was out of the business. So I think the changes that I saw went from where you were able to do home slaughtering when I was in high school, then into buying your hanging beef from your wholesalers such as Wilson's and Armour's and so forth, into box wholesale cuts, and now it's almost another whole generation of ways of handling meat. That's it. End of my story.
Turn the camera on.
Okay, all right.
All right.
I can start like that.
Yeah.
Running?
Uh-huh.
Okay. I'm Eldon Davis. I'm a meat cutter. Way back when I was a butcher, but they changed that updated that to meat cutting. But anyway, I come out of the service, the Korean War in 1954. I went to work for Bullgarts in Marysville under Jim Wiggins, and I took on the job training and on the GI Bill. They paid for that, and that took 18 months to learn that, and I spent another year or two there. Then I moved to Washington for a couple of years. In 1959, I come down here and went to work with Stanley's High Class in September, and I've been here ever since. And Mr. Stanley was a terrific man to work for, and I stayed. And there was other opportunities, but they never given a second thought. Anyhow, and this apron that you see here, it belonged to my father-in-law, Gerald Youngebird, Pat's dad. And when he worked for Marky Brooks, helped slaughter, he wore that. Our aprons that we wore at the store, Vic's wife, Little May, done those up for us, and she kept everything up real clean. And when I first started, we got some meat in tubs. It was already boneless. He brought over some meat, some bull like this. We ground for a hamburger. That's what the liver and the heart and the tongue all come in tubs. And everything else was brought in quarters. We didn't have anything in cryback. No special cuts in like this that was shipped in boxes. Everything was just hanging weight. And that went on all through the rest of the 50s into the 60s. And in the 70s, why it started getting a little bit different, where they started shipping stuff out that was pre-cut and all this. And chickens always came in ice, and they started vacuuming them all the time, so get rid of the ice and all the mess that made. And
What would a quarter or a half weigh that you would have to tote around?
well, most of them weighed well, the hind quarter was always generally the lightest. It probably weighed about 145, 50 pounds. You carried that on your shoulder, and they dropped it off the truck on your shoulder, and you carried it and put it on the hooks in the walk-in. And Front quarters, they were considerably bigger. Some of them would weigh 180 pounds, 175, 80 pounds. Get up on your shoulder though, you can handle them. And that's how that all came about. And if you wanted to, when he was hanging on the hook in the walk-in, you could take your knife in there and cut some chunks down, cut the ribs out, something like this, take your saw and saw that out. So you have to carry it all the way around again, the whole thing. But it also would, every once in a while, if you do something like that, try to cut a piece of meat on the hook, you wound up getting stitches. Because them hooks aren't real solid, and the meat will turn when you cut it, and you're going to cut yourself. And that had happened several times. Okay, this knife here that I used, it was for slicing, like round steak, any kind of steaks, and liver, and anything that was more or less boneless. And these knives like this, these pointed knives, these were used just for boning, because they were a little pretty flexible. You get in around the bone and just get the meat all off the bone before you put it in the pile, send it off to the dogs. And this one here was just, this was your regular cutting knife. Cut up a lot of chickens with that, and just different items with that. And the steel here, here's the one that belongs to Pat Osborne's dad. And this is mine. They're not the same size, but they just, you always use these here to keep your knife sharp. You put it on a sharpener, maybe once a month, and you kept steel on there every day. Every time you cut something, you use steel. And that's pretty well with them done. And this is a cleaver. These, you just cut up the small bones with this. And then when the beef ribs off a cow, or even off of a hog, when their ribs, you could hit that with this, and they would crack and break. So you could go with the saw. And that always came in handy. And this little deal here, this was cleans your block. This is a wooden block, and it's treated, and it's got a lot of wax in it, because that keeps the moisture from going down deep. It just lays around on top, and this you scrape the blood and all the trimmings, whatever you got on there, off with that. And as you can see, there's a little bit right there, and that's more wax than anything. So that's what that is. And salt. We use salt to put on the block at night to absorb the moisture that got into the block, and it draws the blood out and the cleaning fluids that you use when you scrub the block at night before you go home. And this here was a deal that you use to scrape the meat after it goes through the saw to get the bone, they call it bone dust, get the bone stuff off of your meat, make it look pretty before you put it in the case. And these blocks would almost last a lifetime, but this one here has been really well taken care of. It's got one spot here that's been used quite a bit, because you can see the little hollow in it. And that just comes from a lot of years of being used. And there, probably in the late 70s, somewhere along in there, they went to a plastic top. They put a metal frame on each end of this, put a plastic top on it, which is about 2 inches thick. It was real hard. It was easier to keep clean. They said it was more sanitary and all this good stuff. So most all your markers all went to that. And
What do you call the hollow in that top?
that's just from scraping all
I
the
know
time.
what it's for. Didn't you have a name for it?
I don't remember if I did. Probably there is. But I don't remember I don't know what else I could go into.
Were there other butchers in town? Who else, what other names do you know? Who worked for McKee? Who worked for?
Basil done his own meat cutting. And of course Vic, his dad done all the meat cutting before. I mean, after Vic got out of the service, he come down and took over the store. And
Gail Polson worked
Dale,
over at Sutherland's.
Dale Reed was the meat cutter, was cutting meat before I came down here in 1959. And when there was Tom Jolly and someone else bought from McKee, and I think one of them two guys, owners, they cut their own meat, and Tom Hartloff bought the other store there, bought that store when they sold out, and he cut his own meat and his boy. So that's
So isn't it kind of then a lost art, the art of, I mean, somewhere there are men cutting meat, but not in your small town grocery stores anymore, right?
no, they're all in unions now, and they're in the big markets, and they've got a lot of guys in the warehouses are cutting these things up, packaging them and boxing them, and sending them out to, well, like a Walmart or a Kmart, already pre-cut and priced and everything. So Dillon's is about the only place left that really has quality meat cutters, butchers, whatever you want to call them. They still do their own cutting and everything, and they're good people.
So how long were you a butcher?
Well, I started in 1955, and I all the way up through 85. I was a butcher, and then I took a couple years off. And I come back, and I worked for Marvin Feldhausen, and then till they closed the store. And then I went to Waterville and worked for Richard Hardy.
Oh.
Then during deer season, I worked for Alvin Repke over at Waterville, cutting up deer in the meat locker, just part-time. And that's always kept my hand in it somewhere.
Here. Okay.
Yeah, when the meat at the butcher shop on the block, when it's cut and wrapped and sent home with you, it's cut against the grain, more or less. I mean, and then when you get it home and you get it cooked or roast or in the pot,